Hello out there and welcome. My name is Sharon Frosch and I am the Chief Operating Officer of the Discover Your Path U platform, where we believe that every life can teach and everyone can grow. I am also the host of this show, the Connection Sessions, in which we bring together practitioners, entrepreneurs, marketers, artists, spiritualists, mentors, and students to learn from each other's best practices and to authentically create our own. And here today I have with me personal friend, trauma recovery coach, Wiccan, avid reader, Mary Sexton, who I am super excited to have a conversation with. This is a woman who's getting ready to start a really awesome 30-day challenge on sleep and how it relates to trauma recovery in August. So Mary, if you wouldn't mind just introducing yourself, let us know who you are, how you got into the line of coaching that you do, and why you're so passionate about it.
Okay, well, let me talk a little bit first about how I got into coaching in the first place.
Sure.
There are lots of different ways to get into coaching. I actually did it through my job, my old job. I used to work in affordable housing, and the National Training Institute, which is attached to NeighborWorks America, decided that they were going to start doing something a little different. Instead of aiming just directly at practitioners, they were going to try some new types of methods, and one of the things they decided to do was try coaching. So they had an organization called Leadership That Works, came in and gave coaching classes. So that was my first introduction to it, was as part of my work plan for 1 year. I went and took coaching classes. I took 3 that first year, and then I took 2 more later on. A couple of them I took twice, which was interesting because I took them with different instructors and I learned something different each time, which was great. I think sometimes it's easy as a coach to just get one set of tools and not look beyond that. And sometimes those set of tools will work for you. But sometimes someone like me, I have to seek out other stuff, because what I see is that not everything works for everyone. So I'm always trying to help everyone. And sometimes that can be too big a bite and sometimes it's not. So you just have to judge that for yourself if you're a coach. So how I got into trauma therapy was me actually searching for my own cure. I survived a rape in 1986 and a suicide attempt also in 1986. The rape was in May, the suicide attempt was in August. So you can see the obvious connection there.
Yes.
I was really lucky. I got white knighted out of my suicide attempt by someone literally showing up at my house who wasn't supposed to be there. My roommates were gone for the weekend. One had gone home for a wedding. One was in the Grand Canyon taking core samples. Out of nowhere, my friend who was in Phoenix drove up and showed up on my doorstep as literally I was sitting on my bed with my gun loaded and the trigger or the hammer cocked back, and I was just trying to decide where the best place was to put the bullet, because I knew it was going the ammo was light, and I knew it was going to bounce around in my brain. I wanted to make sure that I killed myself and not made myself a vegetable. So I approach suicide more like men do generally than women do. Women are more likely to use pills or cut their wrists. I was like, I'm done. I'm not doing this anymore. I'm just done. And then he walked through the door and literally had a meltdown in the middle of my living room, and I couldn't walk away from him. And that moment of pain for him, I couldn't walk away from that, so that kept me there. Later on, I hooked on to other things. But anyway, so I went to counseling. That's what you do. I went to a crisis intervention group that was attached to the university, which was great. Our first therapist was a really, really great woman who had a lot of good training, who was not a rape survivor. She was not a trauma survivor of any sort. She'd had a really marvelous life, and I really think, that's fabulous. I'm like, so happy for you that you had a great life, but you can't relate to my pain. And that was an ongoing issue. Well, her husband got a job transfer. She left. Our movement therapist, who was fabulous, became the head of the crisis intervention group. She had been physically assaulted, beaten, and ended up in the hospital for, 5 weeks or something like that. She was nearly killed. And she really could relate to the pain and really could relate to what was going on. At that time, post-traumatic stress disorder was practically brand new. It had just gotten shoved in the magic book of diagnosis, and so they were still trying to figure out how that worked and what to do with it, and they were mostly focused on Vietnam vets at that time because that was so much of a problem for them. So I was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. At that time, the only treatment for it was called prolonged exposure therapy.
I'm familiar.
Yeah. Which prolonged exposure therapy is a really difficult therapy because they tell you to replay what happened over and over and over and over. And you tell the story over and over and over again. In theory, you're going to like vent all that stuff out. In reality, for me, it didn't always work that way. I tried writing. I tried writing stuff into stories. I still do sometimes. I still will write traumatic things that happened to me into my short stories. Sometimes it helps, sometimes it doesn't, but it's something that you can try.
Mm-hmm.
So at that time, I did a lot of work then, and then I felt cured. I felt okay. And she warned me when we had our last session. She goes, "This is something you need to remember. Post-traumatic stress disorder cycles.
Yes.
Every 7 or 8 years, it's going to come back around and whack you in the back of the head when you're not paying attention. So watch for those cycles." And it was really true. I saw the cycles come and go. I'd have periods where I was extremely angry, and I'd be like, "Oh, why am I so pissed off?" And then I'd start counting the years back and go, "Oh, okay, well, that's why." So I understand now why I'm so pissed off. So the thing that I regret most about prolonged exposure therapy, and this is something they don't talk about when they train you to do it, and they don't talk about it very much at all, is how much damage you do to other people. Because you're out there spilling your story over and over, all over these people who are now traumatized because you traumatized them with all this drama that they didn't need to have. And, you know, I mean, I was 21, and now, someone past 50, I look back and go, "Oh my God, what did I do? Why did I just not," you know, and it isn't about not telling your story. It's about, be careful what context you tell it in.
Yes.
Don't just walk up to somebody and spill it all over them when they don't have any idea that it's coming. Because that's, you know, that's bad for everybody. So I did the prolonged exposure therapy. I went on my way. I was functional. I did my stuff. In 2017, I hit my 31-year cycle. Now, this is like in the 1990s, there was a huge increase in volume of Vietnam vets going into mental institutes and committing suicide.
Mm-hmm.
I personally knew 6 people who lost Vietnam vets, including my father, during that particular cycle in the 1990s. It was my father committed suicide in 1991.
Mm-hmm.
So I did what I always do. I went straight for a book, sat down and read about Vietnam War, and that 4 times as many men committed suicide after the war as were killed in the war.
Yep.
So give it to the VA. I mean, I don't think that they always have the right method, but they do try, at least to some degree, to help people. They don't always go about it in the right way, but they have been very open about trying. They tried Reiki. They tried lots of different things. They tried EMDR, which works for some people. I've never had a full EMDR session. I know friends that have done it, and 2 of them, it didn't work for them at all, and 1 of them, it was fabulous. So when I talk about trauma recovery, one of the things you have to remember is not all methods are going to work for you, and not all methods are going to be permanent. One of the great things that I learned in prolonged exposure therapy, I actually also learned later in a hypnosis technique where you emotionally detach deliberately. So one thing that I learned was to run a flashback like a movie. I learned to run it forward and backward, which was great, and to stop and start at different points in the scene in my head. So when I get whacked in the back of the head at 31 years in with this huge flashback, I stopped it on that first frame, but then I couldn't get that first frame out of my head. It just sat there like it was waiting to pounce on me. And I'm like, holy cow, there's got to be a better way to do this. So I started looking for other stuff because I'm like, I'm not going to live like this anymore. One of the things that really affected my life that I didn't even know was a symptom for a long time was chronology. It gets all screwed up. I could not remember things as they happened in chronological order without this huge mental acrobatics of going back to, okay, what house was I living in when that was? So how old was I? So what year must that have been? All of this just to remember what had, you know, some little incident that happened would, like 10 minutes, I'd be trying to figure out when that was because I couldn't, my brain would put things in emergency order, not in chronological order. So that's part of it's like your brain gets stuck in, oh my God, something's trying to kill you mode, and you can't turn it off.
The fight or flight.
Right. And that is, I think, one of the most difficult things to deal with. One of the books I read I read it because the title was, I always sit with my back to the wall, which is very, very common in people with
Yes.
post-traumatic stress disorder. You walk into a room, first thing you're doing is looking for the exits. You're looking for who might be a problem, who's going to be an issue. I walk into a room and there's so belligerent drunk in it, I'm out the door. I'm like, I can't stay in this room. So I started searching for other options. I did a little NLP timeline work, which was interesting. It helped me with some stuff, helped me a little bit with my rage. It didn't help me with the chronological issues. It didn't help me with the flashbacks. It didn't help me with that. So I kept looking. So I ran across this doctor. His name is Dr. Stephen King, not related to the horror writer. He's from Vancouver, British Columbia. He is actually an addiction doctor, a counseling doctor for addiction. His theory is that all addiction comes from self-medication because of trauma and shock that has not been cleared out of your system.
Avoidance.
Yes. So he came up with this thing he calls rapid recovery technique, which is a combination of tapping and guided hypnosis to help you release the trauma that happened. And literally, the first time it happened for me, when I went through it with him, it was like, wow, I'm cured. But I can't say that because I know that in 31 years, like, he'll come back and whack me in the back of the head, and I'll be like, okay, but I know what to do now because I got a plan.
Mm-hmm.
So it changed a lot of stuff, including helping me. I don't have that chronology disorder anymore. I can think of things in chronological order. I sat in a room the other day with a group of friends of mine from gaming with my back to a very busy Mexican restaurant. And my friend who was sitting next to me also has post-traumatic stress disorder, and she was really jumpy. And I finally said, maybe you and Mike should switch places because you're not liking this, people walking back and forth behind you. She's like, why are you not bothered? And I'm like, I'm not on the wall today. That's what I call it, is being on the wall. I'm not on patrol. I'm not on the wall. It's not bothering me that they're walking back and forth behind me.
Wow.
So that was like a big deal for me. I mean, I've done it. I've sat with backs to busy rooms if I'm with someone I trust, because I trust them to watch my back.
Mm-hmm.
But when I'm by myself, it was always like, gotta sit with my back to the wall. And I'm much better about that kind of thing. I still am not really keen about crowds, not always, but that's more of a spatial thing. I don't like people in my space, and I have a pretty wide, being from the desert, I'm like, don't get your body temperature anywhere near me because it's 110 degrees. It's just too freaking hot for that. I used to tell my boyfriend, I'm like, don't look at me with that thought in your head. It's too hot for that nonsense. And he'd be like,
wow.
So, there was a lot of stuff going on with that, and the rapid recovery technique really helped me, but I think of it in the box with EMDR. It works really great for some people, doesn't work for everyone. I did have a friend who had been through tons and tons of counseling who came to me and said, you've got to help me. I can't sort this on my own. She hates the word life coach with a passion. And she's like, don't call yourself a life coach. I hate that word. Because she spent thousands of dollars on life coaches, on
Mm-hmm.
psychiatrists, psychologists, everything, trying to clean up this mess that she knows is in the back of her mind. And we'd had a long session. It was 4.5 hours. But at the end of it, she's like, I feel like you just lifted the world off me. And I'm like,
awesome.
you did all the work. I just sat there. And the great thing about rapid recovery technique is you don't have to tell your story to me. I don't need to know that.
Mm-hmm.
I will listen if you want me to hold space for you, but that's not a requirement of the therapy.
Mm-hmm.
I lead you through I lead you through the broad strokes, and you take care of the details.
So, Mary, I want to ask you a question. Sure. You spoke of something that's extremely important both in trauma recovery and in addiction recovery earlier on when you talked about your therapist who had that perfect life. And so you looked at this person and you thought, how could you possibly understand my pain? And I've been there when I went through the homeless program to get sober. They would send people over from UCLA who weren't addicts but were studying addiction. And you could always tell, people would literally bristle when they got into the group room because we would sit across from them. How can you possibly understand what it's like to smoke dope with your kid in a car when you've never had that compulsion? So if there was somebody watching right now who wanted to become a trauma recovery coach, what would your advice be to them on how to get comfortable with their own story so it can become a part of their treatment of others?
I think that the one thing that the prolonged exposure therapy did for me was it's usually easy for me to tell my story.
Mm.
You know, you all have days when you're more emotional. I call them low coping days, days when you're just like, I'm going to go back to bed and pull the blankets over my head. Those are days you don't do it. But generally speaking, you have to be able to tell your story. I read a book not too long ago. I wish I could remember the name of it off the top of my head. But she talks about, she's a journalist, and she wrote a piece that came out in a really big magazine, I want to say New Yorker, where she talked about her rape and very specific detail and the aftermath and what happened. And her rapist was caught and convicted, which is like a miracle. That's like 3%
Yes.
of rape survivors, 3%. One of the things she said is she was sitting at a dinner party, and this lady was sitting next to her, and she was wearing a necklace that had amber on the necklace, and she was very specific about that particular thing. And she said to me, people don't want to hear that. They don't want to hear your story. And I don't think that's necessarily true. I think we need to tell these stories because one of the things when I was very openly talking about it, my group of friends was probably about 16, maybe 20 of us, plus another like 30 or 40 around that were like friends of friends. I would get pulled off to the side walking home from classes, in the movie theaters. They'd be like, can I talk to you? And people would spill their guts, and they never told anyone.
Yep.
And they would tell me, and I would urge them to do something. And none of them wanted to do that. The thing that surprised me is it was almost as many men as there were women.
Yes, that's something that is not understood about rape culture. In fact, I think what people very often fail to understand is that the largest rape culture in the United States is the prison system. And it's on the men's side of the house. And we make fun of that. We make jokes about don't drop the soap in the shower. That's no laughing matter. When you've been raped, making fun of somebody else being raped just guts you inside.
I was reading a romance novel the other day, and I literally threw it across the room. I'm like, this guy's a rapist. He is not acceptable. He cannot be in my world, even in a fictional book. And I'm like, it's really changed how I view romance novels, to be honest. I'm reading one right now that is it's just too cute. It like drips saccharine as you know, it's like too easy, too cute, you know. But I read it because the guy's not creepy, and the girl's a little ditzy, but that's all right. And, you know, they're so in love, and there was no romantic tension in the book at all because they get together in the first chapter, like picked up right where they left off when they were 16 in like 3 minutes. And I'm like, wow, really? Okay. All right. No baggage. And nobody has any baggage after, 15 years of being apart. That's okay.
Of course not.
And that's good. If you don't have any baggage, that's excellent. If you do have baggage, you gotta sometimes set it down. It's too heavy. It's too heavy to carry.
Did you start reading as voraciously as you read now as a way of dealing with what had happened to you, or did that come on later on in life?
That's a really great question, and actually came on earlier. My mother thought I would never learn to read. She was very frustrated by my slow reading because I only learned to read when I was 4. My mother learned to read when she was 3 because her older brothers and sisters thought it was hilarious to teach the baby how to read. My mother had a genius level IQ, so she was very impatient with people who weren't as smart as she was. And I pushed the genius level, but I'm not as high up on the scale as my mother was. And so that was, I think, frustrating for her. I used to say my friend Eileen was the child that she should have had, and I was the one she got stuck with. And my friend Eileen and my mother were always really very close. And so Eileen's like, no, that's not how that works. But so when I did start to read, when I finally started to read, I read everything that wasn't nailed down. So by the time back in the olden days when they used to make everyone take those, the California achievement tests or whatever they were called.
Yes, I'm familiar.
When I was in 5th grade, I scored above high school graduate in 5th grade. So I'm like, can I skip school now? Am I done? Because I already apparently know everything. My mother's laughing at me. So that was a shock to my parents. When I tested for the ACT, I tested really high. which was good for me. I only met people who scored higher than I was when I got to college, which was interesting, because you're used to being like the big fish in the little pond. Then when you go to college, you discover there are people there that just blow you out of the water as far as brains go, but sometimes aren't smart enough to come in when it's pouring. I'm like, dude, it's raining. You need to come inside,
Mm.
because they're not smart enough to take care of themselves sometimes. So everybody has their gifts, whatever that might be. But as for the reading, I read everything. When we lived in Germany, our school library was a 10-foot by 10-foot room, and the bookshelves were only like 3 feet high. So that's as few books as we had for the whole
Wow.
school. I read everything in the school, and then my mother started taking me to the base library, and I would check books out that the adults were reading because I didn't have any other options. There wasn't a lot of books available in English, and so I had to do what I could do with that. And the base librarian thought it was crazy that this little tiny short girl is like taking out all these big stacks of books and bringing them back within like, a couple of weeks, going, can I have another big stack of books?
Mm.
He used to quiz me sometimes. If it had been a book he'd read, he'd quiz me when I came in and ask me what I thought about specific parts of the book and try
Just
to
to make
trick
sure
me.
you'd read it.
Yeah, to see if I was reading the books. And so it's interesting. And people have weird ideas sometimes, I think, about books in libraries. I had a friend in Washington State who once told me that she was in probably 3rd grade before she realized she did not have to read the entire library in alphabetical order, because that's what she thought she had to
That's
do. She thought she
interesting.
had to read all of the books in alphabetical order, and she didn't want to read books about baseball and football and soccer because she didn't care.
Mm.
So she was like, oh, I have to read this book, blah, don't like it. So, but reading and writing was very helpful to me. And it's really weird when I look back at over the course of my writing history, when I read stuff that I wrote when I was 19, when I was 20, in my early 21st year, I read that stuff. It's literally written by someone else. And this is something else you'll also find in the post-traumatic stress disorder literature. A lot of women talk about being murdered. They say that I was dead, and
Yeah.
whatever got up after that fact was somebody else. And
Yes.
that's the bad news. The bad news is you're not going to be who you were before. There's no going back to that other place. There
There's
isn't.
not.
Your brain has literally chemically and physically changed. So until
Can I
they
ask you
figure
a
out,
question? Do
you
you
bet.
do you like different kinds of music than you did before the event? Like for myself,
Hmm.
I almost feel that that dying thing is a very good way of describing it, because I don't like the same kinds of music. I don't talk the same way. I don't even like, my thought patterns are different post-assault as they were pre-assault. And do you have that same experience? And if you do, how would you counsel somebody on not, we have this tendency, especially as trauma survivors, that, well, if I get back to that person, then everything will be okay. Like, it makes it not have happened. So how would you counsel somebody on not chasing the past that way?
It's really, not chasing the past is really difficult, because you really do want to be that person that you were
Yeah.
before, because now you've become this person you don't recognize. Well, the good news
Yeah.
is about that is this gives you a great chance for reinvention, and most people are like, well, I don't want a chance for reinvention. And that may be true, but that's where you are. You can chase the past, like, and music is a good one to point out, because honestly, I didn't think about it until you just said that. I listen to a lot of really soft rock music. Like, I was a big fan of Dan Fogelberg, and now I was listening yesterday to, AC/DC, and I listened to Rob Zombie. I still listen to that. I listen to angry music. I really do. And not all of it's really angry. I mean, I like Everlast, and some of their stuff is angry and some of it's not. So I think that you're going to recover some of who you are. With trauma recovery, the rapid recovery technique I regained carefreeness. I know that sounds weird, but I'd never used the word carefree after that moment in time until I did the rapid recovery technique. And I
Mm-hmm.
went to a movie with a friend of mine. It was Princess Bride. I've seen it 1,000 billion
Oh,
times.
great movie.
But I went to Alamo, where they give you like little bells to ring and little plastic swords to fight with and stuff. And I had a great time. It was the first time I can remember calling how I felt carefree since before the assault. So you'll get some of that stuff back, and I hesitate to say that because chasing that's going to make you miserable. Chasing
Yeah.
that after effect. One of the things, there are several things most people don't understand about rape. Rape is about power. It's not about sex.
Yeah.
Sex is the weapon, but it really is about power. And they'll say, well, there are three kinds of rapists. There's a sadomasochistic rapist, there's a power rapist, there's an opportunistic rapist, but it's all about power. No matter how you boil it down, it's all about power. It's like, I'm going to make myself feel better by destroying you.
Yeah.
That's literally what they're trying to do. And some rapists do kill their victims. So first of all, if you survived the rape, you did what was necessary. No matter what form that took, no matter what happened, you survived, and that was the thing that was the most important thing to do, because that gives you the opportunity to rebuild. Because if you don't rebuild, you let him win. He wins.
Yes.
He gets to take that piece of you forever, and you don't get it ever back. But if you leave that piece behind and find a new piece, then you can move forward. And part of the rapid recovery technique is about retrieving that piece that's been left behind. I haven't worked with anyone who was a really new victim, so I don't know what that looks like in context. I've worked with a lot of people with old trauma that are still many years later trying to find their way back. It's a rough road. You have to just keep picking yourself up over and over again, and it's hard to do that. I'm writing a book on self-coaching, and the title of it is, have you heard the word of matcha? Wow, I just teared up. That's weird. Phew. Anyway, matcha is one of the three sisters of the Morrigan. She's the middle sister. Her name is Battle or Strife. Because it is a battle. You're battling for a new life for yourself, so you can leave all that crap behind. The thing that happens, though, is you get some distance from it, and it whacks you again in the back of the head, and then you feel like you've made no progress. And that's not true. You've made progress. You have some tools. They may not always work, and you may have to seek new tools. So, like I said, I would love to call the rapid recovery technique a cure, but I am hesitant to do that because there hasn't been a test of longevity for that. Because sometimes it'll come back after you much, much later. So sometimes all you can do is just shut the door and move on. And that's really hard, especially when you don't feel like you can get out of bed in the morning.
Yes.
So, and there's a lot of stuff going on right now on the internet about emotional support animals. A lot of people have post-traumatic stress disorder have emotional support animals, even if they're not licensed as such or called that. For me, it was an Old English sheepdog that I knew nobody else was going to take care of her if I did not get my ass out of bed and put food in her bowl and water in her bowl and spend 15 minutes brushing that stupid, ridiculously long dog hair she had. So, and I went to my friend, my white knight, who came in and saved me from suicide, and asked him one time if he would take care of her if something happened to me. And what he said to me was, I'll make sure she gets a good home. And I didn't trust that enough. So for me, I had to stay alive because someone had to take care of the dog.
Wow.
And a lot of trauma survivors lean on that kind of mental trickery, if you want to call it that, to keep themselves going. I was lucky. I had that dog for 16 years. I had a baby. Refreshing. Yeah, I had a baby in the middle of all that. I used to joke with my daughter when she was little. I'm like, well, if it comes down to you and the dog's been here longer, so I don't know what we're going to have to do with you. And she'd be like, Mom, really? So she'd give me the disgusted mom look. But I was always glad they got along really well, and it was never an issue, because from the time I brought Alicia home, Stephen is like, oh, look, it smells like Mom. I guess it's okay. that was the end of it. But if my daughter would cry and I was in the other room, my dog would completely freak out. She'd run from one end of the room to me, and she'd jump on me until I went and got the baby. And that's how my daughter ended up sleeping in my room until she was starting to toddle around, because the dog wouldn't sleep. If the baby moved, it was all over. She could just shift in her sleep. She didn't have to be awake. She'd just shift in her sleep. The dog would be like, the baby's moving, do something. Oh my God, it's moving. So, so there was a lot of joy in that too, having that dog who was, she was a very fluffy, happy-go-lucky dog. I was a fan of Do Not Eat the Daisies when I was a kid, so they had a big, fluffy Old English sheepdog. I found her at the Humane Society. They had thrown her over, her owner had thrown her over the fence and left her there. they had gotten her as a herding dog, and she was not performing as a herding dog. We lived just south of the Navajo reservation, and their herding dogs have to herd sheep. They have to do that, and if they can't do that, then they have no use for them. So, but I was lucky enough to get her and take her home. My one friend used to say, well, Stephen will come and she'll beg with her brown eye. And then if you don't give her any food, she'll turn her evil blue eye on you. And she would too. She'd stare at you.
Well, I am so glad that she was there for you to get you through what I know from personal experience, I know was such a horrible part of your life. And I just want to thank you for being so raw and so real with our audience, because like you said, so many times people who have experienced trauma hide in the shadows, and then the strength of their recovery and of finding themselves again and making a new life out of what's left gets lost into the cracks of time. So thank you so much for being with me today, Mary. Thank you for being your authentic self. Thank you for bringing the joy and the happiness that you always bring into a room with your stories.
Oh, thank you.
I love it. And to anybody out there who's watching right now, if you have been through something traumatic, if you have been assaulted, if you have had an extremely difficult birth that brought you right to the edge of death, if you have been physically assaulted, if something inside of you is there waiting to be healed and to come out, let me strongly suggest that you make contact with Mary here, that you spend some time with somebody who's done a lot of her own personal work and can show you a way through your